Welcome to tonight's spring lecture series, Iconic Painting, Conservation and Technical Study of Iconic Paintings. And tonight Paul Ackroyd is going to be our speaker. Paul Ackroyd has been a conservator at the National Gallery in London since 1986. He is a graduate of the Tate and Courtauld Collaborative Graduate Training Programme in Conservation Easel Paintings in the early 1980s. And after that, he graduated in the early 80s, and after that he continued to work at Tate, with a period in Denmark at a time of research and development in the methods and materials for structural treatment of paintings on canvas, which is clearly a strong influence. He's internationally renowned conservator and is widely regarded as a leading expert in the structural treatment of paintings, in particular works on canvas. He's been incredibly generous with his time and sharing knowledge and skills with more than a generation of Courtauld graduate students and conservation projects working in India and other places. In addition to his conservation practice, he's led and produced innovative research on conservation materials and methods, and published, together with colleagues at the National Gallery, accounts of the conservation of some of the gallery's most iconic paintings. Amongst them, the Coronation of the Virgin by Lorenzo Monaco, Veronese's Adoration of the Kings, and Rubens' Rape of the Sabines. They're some of his favourite pictures that I asked him to mention, amongst others. And more recently, his treatment of Bartolomeo Bermejo's St. Michael Triumphs over the Devil. You can also see him on YouTube removing an old lining canvas from Artemisia Gentileschi's self-portrait. But tonight I'm really delighted that he was able to accept our invitation to the spring lecture series to discuss the treatment of Van Dyck's monumental Charles I on horseback at the National Gallery. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much.
I'll just bring up
Thank you. Great. Well, this is the painting here. This is before treatment, after it was restored in around about 1952 by Arthur Lucas, who was the then chief restorer at the National Gallery. And it is one of 3 equestrian portraits by Van Dyck. This is supposedly the modello for the painting in the Royal Collection. The painting was painted, well, this is probably around about contemporary with the large equestrian portrait, which was painted in around about 1637 to 8. And it's quite a large picture. It's about 3 metres wide by 3.7 metres high, whereas this one is much, much smaller. It's probably about the size of that plinth here. And this is the other equestrian portrait, again in the Royal Collection, painted a little bit earlier in 1634. The painting is on a ticking canvas, a twill weave ticking canvas, and here you see the back of it in 1952 when it was being relined then. And you can see these black lines here, the sort of ticking lines. It's a painting that's made of 2 separate pieces of canvas across a central join here. And just here you can see Charles I's cipher for his collection. So ticking canvas was quite popular in use as sort of a domestic upholstery, as you can see here in this painting by Goltzius. And it was also available in quite wide loom widths. The loom width for the Charles I equestrian portrait would be something around about 1.85 to 1.9 metres. And just incidentally, this was a painting that was stolen by Goering during the war. It's probably the kind of subject matter that he was quite fond of. And this is the detail of the cipher at the back of the canvas. I should say something about the painting's early history, its travel early on, and its conservation history, because that's had quite a pronounced effect on its condition. After Charles's execution in 1649, Cromwell sold the painting in what was called the Commonwealth sale in 1650. It passed on to two separate owners in Flanders, the last of which sold it to another owner in Bavaria, from where it was looted by the Emperor Joseph I, who then gifted the painting to the first Duke of Marlborough in 1706, and from then on it resided at Blenheim Palace until the National Gallery bought it in 1885. It was the last painting that the government or the Treasury actually paid directly for a painting for the National Gallery, and at that time it was bought for about £17,500. In 1650, its first sale was for £200, so it had gone up in value enormously. Throughout all these changes in ownership, as it travelled from London to Antwerp to Bavaria and Munich and so on, it would have been taken off of its stretcher or wooden frame and rolled up and transported on a horse and cart or by ship. And this is and that has created a sort of horizontal, this is the horizontal direction of the painting here in the clouds, a sort of horizontal craquelure pattern in the picture. It's also made quite a lot of damage at the sides of the painting where the painting is split. And also, when the painting was rolled up, it was tied. When it was on the roll, and it's tied, and that tying has been, you know, on this side of the painting, which is the right-hand side, it was tied very tightly, and it sort of crushed the paint in these areas. So there's a series of these kinds of losses that go from the top to the bottom of the picture. But since the gallery's owned it, it's not really been out of the gallery very much. In the First World War, it went to Overston Park near Northampton, and in the Second World War, it was evacuated to Penryn Castle, and then a year later, in 1941, to the Manod slate mines in Wales. And this is just a picture of it returning in June 1945 at the end of the war. And here it's in what was called an elephant case, like an enclosed A-frame, being hoisted into the gallery. So it's always been a very, valued picture in the collection. It's always, or normally, it's been exhibited in room 31, which is the room as you come in through the main entrance hall, and the painting forms a vista for the visitors coming in through the main entrance. In 1885, the painting was relined. When it was bought, it had already been lined, probably in the Duke of Marlborough's time. One of the Dukes of Marlborough probably had it lined and probably cleaned and restored at the same time. We have no record of when that was done. But in 1885, it was relined again by someone called William Morrell, who is a second generation of quite a well-known dynasty of liners operating in London for the art market. And at that time, the National Gallery didn't have a conservation department. It employed private restorers. So Morrell lined it in 1885, and then 4 years later, in 1889, he was asked to reline it again because the central join, which you can see here, was a bit too pronounced. It was too raised. So on his second lining, which he took the first one off and to redo it, he undid a lot of the spare canvas at the back of the canvas on the seam here, and undid quite a lot of the sewing, the stitching. So the stitching was removed all the way across from about here, all the way across to somewhere here in the painting, but the ends remained stitched together. They remained well stuck. So during his second relining, which he did a double relining with two canvases using a glue paste adhesive, that's animal glue mixed with flour paste with a very high proportion of glue, during the lining, these two pieces began to shrink apart here. So you have a gap at about 5 to 7 millimetres here. But here, it didn't shrink because it was held. But as these two pieces shrunk, it created a sort of pucker or a bulge in the canvas, which came away from the lining canvas, which had to be ironed flat. So it's a bit like this, a sort of bulge being created like that, and then you have something with a very large surface area here of the canvas, trying to stick it back down onto something with a smaller surface area. And so what happened was they sort of creased it like that during the ironing of that area, and that's why we now have this loss here, which is about 0.5 metre. The other kinds of damage created probably by Morrill in 1885 or 1889 was a lot of sort of small little pitted losses here. When he was taking the linings off, a lot of the old glue had got trapped underneath the picture, and as he was scraping the back, it made lots of little holes, and these are mostly around the edges, all the way around the edges of the picture. And here you can see the splits caused by the rolling. And the other kind of damage that would have occurred during Morrill's linings was the impasto would have been squashed. I mean, the lining would have been carried out with hand irons, heated hand irons over the front of the picture. The front of the picture would have been protected with some tissue or paper, but nonetheless, I mean, the heat and the weight of the irons would have squashed quite a bit of the impasto. So Morrill's lining really lasted until just after the Second World War, when it had begun to buckle. It begun to undulate, really, in response to humidity. And also at the edges, the lining canvas had started to fray and become quite brittle and torn. So in 1948, in Lucas's treatment, which began in 48 to 1952, it was decided to replace Morrill's lining. And this too had quite a number of problems. Rather than using glue paste, he used wax resin. But he first had to take off both of Morrill's double lining, which was quite an arduous task. It had to be softened, the glue had to be softened with moisture and ethanol, a 1-to-1 mixture of ethanol and water, in order to soften it before it could be scraped off. And this caused quite a bit of damage, quite a lot of abrasion to the back of the original canvas. And also at the end of that, having wetted the back of the canvas, the back of the canvas was rippled and undulated in response to all the water. But he didn't really carry out any flattening treatments before doing his wax resin lining. The wax resin lining was executed with the painting face down, with the lining canvas placed on top, stretched onto a wooden frame, and the wax resin would have been applied both to the back of the original painting and onto the lining canvas, and then it was ironed from the back of the lining canvas just to loosely tack the painting onto the lining canvas, and then it was turned over, and then ironing continued from the front being protected by a facing tissue. But really the irons, because they were ironing from the front, they were worried about too much heat, because in a wax resin lining you have to use a bit more heat than you would do in a glue paste lining, somewhere around about 65 degrees or that sort of temperature. So they didn't really get the wax hot enough to get it to flow, to form an nice even layer, and nor did it stick very well. So this is the painting, sort of raking light photograph of the painting after Lucas's wax resin lining. And really the distribution of the wax was quite thick and uneven, and you can see it's got all these sort of undulations and lumps and bumps in the surface. And that's just a detail of it. You can see sort of things here and areas like that where, I mean, this is an area where it's been scraped at the back and it's taken out a thread at the back, and then this area is sunk the paint sunk into this area during the lining. So it was really quite a mess. And this is the back of the wax resin lining. So it's, I mean, normally you'd expect this to look quite nice and even and smooth. But this really, whoops, does look like a dog's dinner. So I'll just move on to the current treatment. Lucas also, well, I'll say something about Lucas's cleaning. Lucas also cleaned the painting in between 48 and 52. And you have to remember really that in 1948, this was the year after the 1947 cleaning controversy at the gallery, which resulted in a parliamentary inquiry and the subsequent Weaver report of 1947. And when this was suggested for cleaning, the curatorial staff were very windy about attracting further criticism of a painting that was going to be cleaned. And you have to bear in mind, this had never been cleaned whilst it was at the National Gallery until 1948-52. And it had quite a lot of old varnish layers and dirt layers on it. So a cleaning of this painting would have made a dramatic difference. So Lucas was asked to partially clean the picture, only remove part of the varnish and some of the old restorations. But when he came to this area, whoops, I've done it again, this area of the sky, you can see this has been really quite severely over-cleaned sometime in the past, probably in the 18th or early 19th centuries when it was at Blenheim Palace. Other areas which were badly abraded were around the back of the horse here, some parts in the foreground here. There was some little area here where you just got the bare grey priming, where there were some rocks which had been removed. So in the end, he actually cleaned quite a bit more. In order to properly restore this sky, he had to take off most of the restoration and the varnish. And in order to make this area look more in keeping with the other areas, he had to clean a bit more here. But he did leave a lot of old varnish and restoration in these sort of areas. So this is a during cleaning photograph. So this is part the way through the removal of Lucas's retouchings and old varnish layers. These are present here and they've been cleaned around this sort of area. Lucas's retouchings were done in sort of oil paint and watercolour, something sort of colours that don't really last. They darken or blanch. The watercolours blanch within a short period of time and the oil paints darken in a probably even more rapid amount of time. And the varnish, which was a mastic varnish, to which he'd added, interestingly, some tobacco seed oil, which is a sort of brownish oil. He'd probably added this in order to give the painting a little bit of a golden glow to it, in order to make it look less bright and cleaned. So the current treatment began with the cleaning, which is what's happening here. The reason for relining it was not just because the surface was undulated and lumpy. It was also that the original was coming away from the lining canvas. And here you can see I'm slipping in a spatula just to show it's becoming really quite loose at the edges. So at the outset, I made a sort of template of all the lumps, bumps, depressions and damages in the picture onto this thick layer of Melanex, just drawing with felt pens onto this Melanex sheet. And that was to prove useful later on to accurately locate some of these damages at the back of the canvas later on in the treatment. So following that, the painting was faced. I faced the join, first of all, with some Japanese tissue and wheat starch paste mixed with sturgeon's glue. The idea of that, which I'll explain in a minute, and then that was followed by a general wax resin facing applied cold in white spirit. So the idea was that at a later time, when I needed to turn the painting over from being face down back to face up, I could use a roller to do that. And I wanted that join to be reinforced during that time, but be able to take that general wax resin facing off and leave that facing in place over the join. So I could take that off with white spirit, and that would be left in place. And then the painting was taken down to a lower studio, and as you can see, it only just about fits. We had done other paintings before in the past that weren't so difficult to get into the lining studio. And the problem was that people had built all this ducting in between times from the last time we'd done it. So it had to sort of be shuffled along here, and probably someone getting squashed. And then into the lining studio, and then face down on a table covered with silicon-coated Melanex. And then you can see here the back of how uneven the back of the painting looks here, with all the uneven distribution of wax resin. So here we're just taking the painting off the stretcher. I should have said earlier that this whole project was sponsored by the Getty. It was part of their canvas paintings initiative to try and train people to do structural work on canvases. So we had about 7 people from other European institutions and American institutions helping us to do this. So this is the stretcher coming off. And that's the back of the lining canvas. So the lining canvas was just taken off in strips. And it was quite easy to get off because the lining canvas had become quite brittle, and in parts like at the edges it just wasn't stuck at all. And to get into the middle of the painting, we had these sorts of pads that you could kneel on. You just had to be careful, because you've got joins in the table here and here. You just had to be careful that you didn't actually tread on or put pressure on the painting over those joins, and at times you just had to move the painting across the table to avoid them. And then after the lining canvas was peeled away, the wax resin had to be removed, and the bulk of it was removed with these sharpened metal strips. Whoops. These sort of things here. You can see how brittle it is. You just sort of touch it with one of these and it'll all just fly out into your face. And so we try and get it down to something like this state with the metal strips, and then this area, like here, would be just removing the last vestiges of the wax resin with scalpels. And you can see how, again, how uneven the distribution of wax really is. I mean, at some points it was about sort of like 7 or 8 millimeters thick in parts. This is just more of the same. And that's, again, just getting it down to this kind of level, which is what we wanted to achieve. The next stage was really addressing all the abrasions at the back, which had probably been caused by Lucas in 1948 to 52. And there were some holes, as you can see here. And there's just small depressions here. So these areas were consolidated with an aqueous acrylic adhesive and then filled with a polyvinyl alcohol and chalk filler, which was sort of tinted to, as you can see, sort of here, to more or less match the canvas colour. And this is just a shot of the edges here, and you can see the sort of black ticking canvas. This was a lump of priming. It's probably original grey priming that was that was somehow been put onto the back of the painting. And again, you've got all these splits at the sides, which have really been caused by the painting having been repeatedly rolled. And these are really quite fragile. You couldn't really lift these up or move them too much without, propagating that that tear or split across the picture. The next stage, after dealing with all the abrasions at the back and the holes, was to put in inserts of new canvas, and this is what's happening here and here. And this was a fresh linen canvas, oil primed, adhered with a PVA adhesive. You just sort of draw around the edges, cut them out, and then glue it in. Go over with a warm spatula to make sure it's well stuck, and then leave it with a board and weights overnight until it's dry. And it was quite useful just marking out all the areas that you needed to deal with chalk, so you didn't forget where they were. And a lot of this work was done under sort of raking light conditions, as you can see here. Again, there's these more of the filling. You can see here in this loss, you've got the red ground. The canvas is prepared with the red ground followed by a grey priming. And this is the canvas has been scraped away here, just leaving the red ground visible, and a bit here as well. So all these needed to be filled. Otherwise, when you come to do the lining, you just end up with big depressions at the front. And this is just more of the same, really, just getting all the filling level to the back surface. And this is the Melanex template made at the beginning, which was used to lay over the back to locate all these small damages. I mean, things like that crease that happened along the join, that was quite successfully flattened by locating it accurately on this template, just using moisture and a bit of heat from a hot spatula. But other areas, like a lot of these small little damages which are marked here and here, are little holes which have got indentations in the front. And it just really wasn't possible to improve on those at all. And so the painting was given a general flattening treatment as well, just using sort of old-fashioned boards and weights. The areas were locally dampened in an area this sort of size here, and then left overnight. This is it being dampened here, and you'd start from the centre of the painting, working outwards, so that you weren't moving any distortions into the middle of the picture, which you then had to chase out again towards the edges. So it was quite important to do it in that order. This is the crease being ironed, and the join was reinforced with a material called Stable-Tex, which is a sort of gauze-like polyester material impregnated with an adhesive called Glasgow 375, which is a sort of an adhesive that's akin to Beaver 371, which is what we used for the lining adhesive. It had been planned at the outset to turn the painting over, so now it was really in a state where we could turn the painting over and get it face up again. And I had planned to do this by rolling it and then unrolling it face up. That would be the simplest way of doing it. But I was really quite concerned about all these splits at the sides. And in rolling it, they may just split even further right across the picture, because the painting is quite fragile at these points. So we decided instead to attach a temporary strip lining to the front of the picture, which is what's happening here. This is a material called Satafil, which is again a very thin polyester, onto which we put some beaver film on here, which you could put underneath the picture like here, and then heat from the back, so that you just loosely tack this strip lining onto the front, and the front being covered with the facing tissue still. And this is what's happening here. So that's the painting with the temporary strip lining on it. And then we had we got the stretcher and put a polycarbonate, transparent polycarbonate panel screwed to to one side of it, and carried that over and put it on top of the picture like that, and then stretched the strip lining and the painting onto the stretcher. Oops. This is what's happening here. And then we slid another polycarbonate panel here underneath the front of the picture. So it wouldn't, when we lifted it up, it wouldn't sort of belly out. And then it was a matter of just moving it off the table and turning it face up. So the front, this is the front here with the polycarbonate panel at the front, so which was just taped to the front of the stretcher. So it does take, quite a lot of people and quite a lot of logistics of planning to do this. And that's it. The top sheet coming off and the painting being slid back onto the table with all the facing still there. And then the facing was removed with white spirit and a little bit of moisture for the Japanese tissue across the join. The next job was all these inserts that we put in from the back. The inserts weren't quite as thick. The insert canvas wasn't quite as thick as the original canvas and paint. So when we put them in, they would be level or flush with the front of the painting. So we had to then push them back to be level with the back of the painting, so that they would stick well to the lining canvas. And then the next stage was to fill the painting, fill the losses before lining. And again, we used the same kind of polyvinyl alcohol mixture with chalk, this time tinted grey to match the colour of the original grey priming. And this is the filling, again being done in raking light so that you can get it exactly level to the topography of the picture. And then the painting was just put on back onto the panel stretcher again and left until we prepared the lining canvas and the vacuum envelope, which was the method we chose to do the lining. The vacuum envelope is essentially like a plastic bag in which you suck out the air. You put the painting in the bag and you suck out the air using vacuum pumps, and then you heat it up on a separate heat source. But I'll explain that in a minute. So this is we had to do prepare the lining canvas in the upper studio, because in the previous studio down here we just didn't have the ceiling height. So this is the loom or wooden frame which we used, and that's the lining fabric here, which was a linen canvas, one single piece of linen with a double warp and a double weft thread. So it was quite a strong, robust canvas. So this is the canvas just being first stretched onto the loom, and then it was wetted and pre-stretched 3 times. So it's wetted here, left overnight to dry, and then after it's dried the following day, it's then stretched again and then wetted again and so on. So we did that 3 times. And here you can see the Courtauld's Botticelli in the background there. So that's it being re-stretched after wetting. And then on the final wetting, we used a deacidifying solution of magnesium bicarbonate. And that's just added really to improve the longevity of the lining canvas, to ensure that it doesn't get into an advanced state of embrittlement over time. So that is the painting now wetted and pre-stretched. It's now ready to be prepared with the lining adhesive, which, like I said, was Lasco 375, heat seal adhesive 375, which is a version of Gustav Berger's Beaver 371, which was developed in around about 1968 to 70. and it's essentially an EVA, an ethyl vinyl acetate based adhesive with some addition of a polycyclohexanone resin and some paraffin wax, some microcrystalline wax. Although the original formulation has changed slightly. So these are the participants sort of booted and suited, ready to put on the adhesive, which is rather smelly. It's a sort of white spirit based adhesive which you have to heat up. You add white spirit to it. So this is a solution, this is a sizing solution, so to make sure that the lining canvas is thoroughly impregnated with the adhesive. And this is a solution of about 2 parts white spirit to 1 part of adhesive. And this not only provides a nice sort of looking uniform surface at the back of the painting after lining, it also helps with the reversibility of the lining in the future by ensuring that a lot of the adhesive remains stuck to the lining canvas rather than to the back of the original when you peel the lining canvas away. So this is the whole thing being sized. And then after that, once it's sized, it's quite easy to get rid of any knots and imperfections in the canvas weave, either using scalpels or sanding it with sandpaper. And then once that's been completed, you've got a nice sort of smooth surface. And then the actual layers of adhesive, the lining adhesive, go onto the canvas. And here we have about 6 coats of Beaver, Lasco 375, 1-to-1 in white spirit, brushed on to the lining canvas, allowing about 24 hours drying time between each coat. So this provided quite a smooth surface, smooth conformation on the canvas, and a quite even layer. So this was then taken off the loom, covered with Melanex, and then taken downstairs on a roller. So it's being rolled up and then taken in the lift downstairs. The next stage was to prepare the vacuum envelope on the same table where we had done all the de-lining and repair work on the painting. So the bottom layer of the envelope, the bottom part of the plastic bag, if you like, consists of 3 thick layers of Melanex. That's about, when I mean thick layers of Melanex, it's about the same thickness as the sort of acetate sheets that you used to use for giving lectures and things like that, which you don't do now. So those are taped together, 3 long sheets like that, because these sheets only come in limited roll widths of about 1.6 metres. So you need 3 of them taped together, and they're taped with good quality sellotape. And you have to use good quality sellotape, otherwise the whole thing comes apart. And then on top of that, there's thinner sheets of silicon release Melanex, which you can see being, these green tabs here are just holding that silicon Melanex onto the thicker sheet of Melanex. And this prevents the lining canvas from sticking to the thick layer of Melanex. So here you can see it better. This is the release Melanex and the thicker sheet here. The lining canvas is rolled out onto that, and then the painting is slid onto the lining canvas, and then the loom is then positioned. It's the same loom we use for the preparation of the lining canvas, except that these edges are being reinforced with more wood to stop these edges bowing when the lining canvas and so on are stretched onto it. And then holes are drilled here to allow tubing connected to the vacuum pumps. There's the holes. And the Melanex, this is the lining canvas and Melanex being taped, stapled and taped to the loom. So the Melanex layer had to be stapled through tape. otherwise the Melanex might tear. And then after that, it was all sealed up with a further layer of tape, and that prevented any leakage of air inside the envelope. So the next stage was to put some silicon release Melanex around the edges of the picture here, and this prevented the later top sheet of Melanex sticking to the beaver at the edges, or the Lasco adhesive at the edges. And that was important because if it does stick, then you can't evacuate the air from the centre of the painting out towards this tubing. So the air extraction system consisted of these plumbing pipes. They're just ordinary domestic plumbing pipes which were drilled with holes at regular intervals, which are then placed around the edges of the picture with the holes just pointing downwards onto this canvas webbing, which again aids the airflow. And then all these pipes going around the edges are then connected to this tubing here, which goes out to the vacuum pump through these joints here. And any sharp edges in the envelope had to be covered up, like the keys at the edges here had to be have foam on them, or these edges had to be rounded, because when the whole thing is under vacuum, the top sheet of Melanex can tear, and that would break the vacuum completely. So all these bits here had to be sealed with a bathroom silicon sealant, as you can see here. And so the whole thing, here's the top layer of Melanex in place. Again, this had to be done with 2 sheets joined together with a bit of masking tape. And then really we're ready to turn on the vacuum pumps. So there's 2 vacuum pumps, one at each end. And that's the painting under vacuum. There wasn't any pressure gauges on the vacuum pumps. So we had to drill 3 holes in each end. You can see the 3 holes here, 1, 2, 3. So that introduces an air leakage and a reduction in the pressure. And that was just to give you enough pressure so you can just comfortably push that top layer of Melanex off the surface of the picture. So that's the whole thing, really, ready to be lined. And essentially, this vacuum envelope is not that different to the vacuum envelope that was developed at the Courtauld by Jerry Headley, Stephen Hackney, and Alan Cummings in the early 1970s. And this just shows a photograph of their vacuum envelope. It's just smaller, and it has a different vacuum extraction system. And here they're using what was called a traversing infrared heater underneath as the heat source, whereas we used a lining table, which I'll show you later. And this is Jerry Headley here. So here we have the air extraction is just sort of thick canvas webbing and string, and the vacuum pumps are here, which are just attached to a hole in the front layer of Melanex. So the painting had to be, because it was large, it was larger than the table, the lining table that we had to act as the heat source. So we had to line the painting in 2 halves, in two different sections. We'd done this with this painting, Veronese's Adoration of the Kings, again, which had to be done in 2 sections. And I mean, this does create a bit of a problem, because as you heat up one half, so if you heat up this half here, this half remains cold, but this half that's heating up is expanding, and across the join between the hot and the cold areas, you can get sort of undulations forming, and it's undulations in the entire envelope. It's not the painting coming away from the lining canvas, it's everything just undulating, which did happen with this, and you can see us looking quite concerned here at the edge. I mean, it is quite easily resolvable just by warming the surface up with an iron after the lining. while keeping it under vacuum. But it would be, we try to remove that kind of problem. One way of doing it really was to use heated blankets. So the unheated, this is the half which is on the table being heated here, and the unheated half is here. So we put domestic blankets, just heated blankets for the bed, on top here and covered it with aluminium foil to retain the heat. And that gave you a temperature of about 38 degrees at the top of the picture. And also, this is the table here, the heated surface. So this is where the unheated part would go. And at this join across here, we wanted to heat this join up a bit more, so we used these fan heaters underneath. I mean, it's quite Heath Robinson. And the other thing we did was to tape some foam, about 1 centimetre thick foam across this edge here, which would lift the envelope away from the surface of the lining table, creating a bit of an air gap across here, which again would reduce the temperature just at the part, just across this area here. Again, which would help to prevent these undulations from occurring. So again, this is just a detail of that foam strip. This is another painting that we lined, another large painting. This is the largest painting in the gallery's collection. It's about 5 metres by 3 metres, which we couldn't do in an envelope. It was too big to do in the studio. So we used a different method, which was really having 2 rollers either side of that lining table. A bit like an old 35 millimetre film carousel. So you'd wind one part on, heat it up, and then take it onto this roller and so on. And that had to be done in 3 sections. But the interesting thing about that was, here, the painting and the lining canvas come over here, and there's an air gap here. So that's why we wanted to create that air gap at the edges, because we didn't get any ripple distortions in this painting, in this lining at all. So this is the beginning of the lining. So we have it the painting under vacuum, and here I'm just rolling out the centre of the painting, trying to get rid of any trapped air in between the painting and the lining canvas before it is moved on to this table at the back here. So the whole thing is then lifted across from the table onto the lining table. The domestic blankets are put into place and covered with foil. And the ends of the painting, that were not on the table, were supported by these adjustable props here. And the top surface of the painting was independently measured with these sort of thermocouples. We had quite a number of these over the surface of the picture, so that we could measure the temperature. And when the temperature at the front reached around about 68 degrees, then we could move the painting to do the second half of the lining. These are more different set of thermocouples here. So everybody, we rehearsed this the day before, so everybody had their own role to play. Somebody was looking at the thermocouples, somebody was looking, moving the vacuum pumps, and other people were helping to move the loom across. And when the temperature got to around about 45 degrees centigrade, which is about the sort of softening point of the adhesive, we then used hot spatulas over the front. These warmed hot spatulas heated to about 60 degrees to try and remove any last remaining little distortions in the picture. There were some distortions at the back end of the horse in the tail, which were probably created by Lucas in 1952 when they were ironing from the front, and they probably got the back end of the iron and dug it into the picture surface. So there were a series of diagonal indentations in the painting, which I couldn't get out during the flattening treatments before the lining. But during this operation of going over the area with a hot spatula, they were removed quite surprisingly actually. And this, again, this is now the second half. So once that half has reached 68, then the painting was moved across so that the next half could be done. So all the domestic blankets, heated blankets were removed, and the foil removed and then just placed onto the already heated end just to retain some of that heat. But despite all those measures that we used to try and stop those undulations from occurring, they did begin to occur. But they quickly disappeared when we actually raised the end of the loom on the props so that we created a larger air gap across here, and then they just quickly disappeared. So once the lining had been done, it was just then removed from the table and put on, from the lining table and put onto this wooden table where it would cool within about 15 minutes. And that's the beauty of this kind of method, really. You don't, if you use a lining table to line something, you have to wait probably a couple of hours for the painting to cool down because you've got all that body of metal waiting for that to cool down, whereas you don't have that here. It just cools very rapidly back to room conditions. So then the envelope was simply dismantled, the loom taken off, and then the painting, the next day, the painting was stretched onto its stretcher. So here you have some of the voids in the stretcher were filled with foam sheets to stop the painting dipping in to the voids. And then it was positioned, the painting was positioned on the stretcher face up so you could see where it was going to fit onto the stretcher. And then it was turned over so it was face down because it was just much easier to stretch it face down like this. And this is Team Getty here. We have Lisette Voss from the Rijksmuseum, Eva Martinez from the Prado, Gerrit Albertson from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Camille Polkonik, who's now here at the Courtauld, Luigi Arata from the OPD in Florence, and Francesca Bettini from the OPD in Florence. So I was extremely grateful to them for all their hard work. And finally, this is the painting after restoration. It's now fully cleaned and restored, and will go back on display in the middle of March when a new frame has been made for it. Thank you very much.